We've got Mark and Magpie, or Adam and Magpie, coming from the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center. They are working, tracking some of the nation-state organizations and threats against Microsoft and our customers. So with that.
Hi. So yeah, we're in the threat intelligence team within Mstic. So multiple teams within Mstic, but we focus exclusively on tracking the nation-state actors. And this is kind of a review of last 12 months and some of the achievements we've had. Not all of them. Some of them we're not going to talk about today, even though we hold them dear in our hearts. But there's definitely been some that have made the press coverage, and there's some that we just want to kind of highlight in terms of the pieces that go beyond that kind of like everyday business as usual. So at Microsoft, we track the groups as periodic elements of the periodic table. We've got about 132 at last count, I think. Some of those are in kind of a development state. Some of them are fully fledged. And we've kind of progressed over the years, which we're kind of in like the third iteration now of the kind of Mstic team, where we're doing a lot more work with CELA in terms of the Defending Democracy initiative, a lot more in the space of kind of disruption to some of these actors that are affecting our clients across the various products and services that we have. And we spend our kind of days tracking at least 30 of those groups sort of full-time, and then others as and when we either receive intel or there's reason to kind of focus in on them a little bit more. We are now Redmond, Reston just outside of DC, Cheltenham, and soon to be Israel as well. So we're expanding in terms of geo, and that kind of brings new insights in terms of the kind of threat actors we see when we're talking with government and industry partners. Yeah, should have done that as I was talking, but anyway, I'll hand over to Adam to talk about some recent work.
Thank you. So about this time last year, or about December of last year, there was some news articles that came out saying that we, working with Facebook, and in reality another organization that chose not to be named, we took some action against some North Korean adversaries. So we have a group we call Zinc. I tend to stay away from the term Lazarus. For those that aren't TI people in here, you might roll your eyes, but the reason I do that is Lazarus sort of has been associated with a bunch of different meanings. Some people sort of use it to say anything North Korea, others use it to relate to something from like the Blockbuster report from Novetta a few years back. But Zinc is sort of a subset of that that we track, and their sister groups might be like those who are going after the Swift banking organization. So we targeted specifically Zinc and some of the stuff they were doing. What was unique about this, so the reason we did this was, WannaCry is really the big push. So that affected a lot of our customers, affected a lot of people in this world. We thought it was a step way over the line, and so we wanted to figure out if we could do something about it. Another thing that happened in that time frame that is sort of out there in the public was Zinc also started targeting utility providers here in the U.S., and we didn't want to see that escalate to something really bad. And so we got together with Facebook and a few other places and tried to see what we could do about it. And so we sort of combined our unique forces and took some action. So as Microsoft, we have a capability called MSRT, the malicious software removal tool. This has been talked about publicly, so it's sort of a way for us to, if there's like a really bad piece of malware, think like a worm, like config or something, it's a way for us to go push a signature to delete that globally on any Windows install that's receiving a Windows update, essentially. And so we pushed about, it was about 8 families from Zinc into MSRT in December. And so one morning in December, these adversaries woke up and a lot of their stuff was gone. So a lot of their access was deleted, maybe even on some of their own systems, as well as their servers, et cetera. And on top of that, we also went after their accounts. So not just Hotmail, Outlook accounts, et cetera, Facebook accounts, but also some of their social media profiles. So if anyone read through the 130-page indictment from a few weeks ago from Pak Jin-yuk that the FBI released, they sort of hinted to there being some LinkedIn profiles, other social media profiles, and I'll talk to those in a second. So we went and shut all those down. I think it was well over 200 accounts that we took down all at once. But the thing with the social media profiles is sometimes those are things that take them a lot of time to build up. So they have to build a repertoire, they have to build friends and connections, and so deleting all those is pretty painful for them. overall, what was the impact of that? We didn't expect to get rid of them forever. They did sort of die down and do nothing for about a month, and we didn't see anything from them for a month. And when they came back sort of just solely focused on cryptocurrency exchanges. They did change their tooling up a bit, using some of their older tools that weren't directly sort of affected by this. And since then, we've only seen a few things sort of creep back in. So they're still operating. Would we do it again? I don't know, but it's sort of an option we exercised here. So I talked briefly about social media stuff. So LinkedIn in particular, obviously we purchased LinkedIn a few years ago. We've been working with them on this. The indictment talked about the profiles, but didn't really go into much detail about them. So here were two. They had several. You'll notice both of these are people that claim to work for defense industry companies. That doesn't mean they were targeting these companies. What they do is they were creating these profiles to sort of exist in that industry, and then they try to connect with people in the industry. And so obviously LinkedIn's a very powerful platform for them, because they can say, I'm really interested in a certain person that works on a certain technology, and so they can use LinkedIn to find that person. And then what they do is they try to connect to them, and once they connect, they don't necessarily send malware over LinkedIn. Once you're connected, you can view the person's contact email. So they'll take that contact email, and then they'll craft an email using a recruiter's name, and it's a recruiter they found on LinkedIn, and say, hey, I'm from such and such company. You can see me on LinkedIn. I've got this great job opportunity. You should totally open this document with macros enabled, because it's going to tell you all about the awesome stuff you could work for here. And so I'm not going to say they were super effective with that, but that's a technique they've continued to use as they go across different industries. The other interesting thing about these profiles is, like, real people would go and endorse them and say, like, oh yeah, this person's great. They leave like a full testimony about how great they are to work with. Little do they know they were endorsing a North Korean hacker, right? And so also, like, I've shown some of these to some of our internal security trainings, and people sort of get scared realizing that they could have connected to a North Korean hacker. And like, one of the obvious ways to find these is you actually just sort of look for like the best looking pictures. So like, one thing we've joked about is, what if you could like pipe all profile pictures through Hot or Not, and then you just look for like the ones that are at the very top. Those might be North Korean hackers. So another thing about so those accounts are a little over a year and a half, 2 years old. And at the time, the interests were all like defense related. But then about a year and a half ago, we saw them start adding interest to like cryptocurrency type exchanges or interest groups. And so we think some of the same people who were involved with this defense targeting started using these accounts to then target some of these cryptocurrency exchanges that we've heard about in the news. Another piece to Zinc that hasn't really been talked about, but we have some unique visibility on because of Azure. So we're constantly tracking this group in particular. And about a year and a half ago, there was a piece of malware we came across, and the C2 server one of the C2 servers ended up being an Azure instance. And so we worked directly with that customer to get permission to conduct an investigation there. And the insights it gave us was pretty awesome. And so one of the things we learned, so Zinc, like 99% of their infrastructure at the time was all compromised infrastructure, stuff they go out and compromise and use. And so in this case, we found a vulnerability or they were using a vulnerability in Managed Engine Service Desk, which is like a IT help desk tool. They were just scanning the internet for that, finding it, exploiting it to upload a file. They'd pop this web shell on there, very, very generic, gave them a way to upload files and run commands. Wasn't anything super fancy, but this does run on top of, this is running on top of Tomcat. So we actually found cases where they've actually developed like a full server-side suite, all built on using JSP, that we've only seen them use once so far, but they do have it out there. And so once we get information like this, we turn around and we're going to scan the rest of Azure for it, try to find other instances that might have been compromised, maybe using the same web shell, using the same exploit and vulnerability. And then what they do with all this infrastructure as well is they also go and they set up like a big proxy network that they'll sort of bounce everything through. There's a good paper by Group IB that was released a little over a year ago where they go into this in a bit more detail, but one of the tools we ended up recovering was their manager for some of this proxy infrastructure. So when I first got this, I was hoping to be much more exciting, but no, it's pretty dead simple. But this is essentially what they would use on their end to manage all these compromised nodes that they've acquired. So there's another group that we track, call them Thallium. They are not super advanced at all. They are not, they did not show the best, most awesome techniques out there, but they're still extremely effective. And so, of course, as a TI analyst, I would love to track someone super advanced, like the stuff we heard today about Turlo or Equation Group. But this is still a big problem for our customers, and so we're still going to focus a lot of efforts on this. And so, a large majority of their attacks are all just standard phishing emails. Hey, you have unusual sign-in activity. Review your activity, and when they do that, they're going to get to a login page, a very generic O365 login page. We also have seen cases where they'll create, if you're an O365 tenant and you have, like you can set up a custom-looking login page, they'll emulate that and make it look like that. This has actually led us to do some interesting things on the O365 ATP side, where we'll use like the Azure Computer Vision API to look at the site they're about to click on, and if it looks like one of our login pages or one of the customer's login pages, but it's not actually hosted on the right domain, we'll block that and flag it. Most recently, though, they started doing something interesting over the past 2 to 3 weeks. So they were sending out links, and the links, if you click them from a non-Chrome user agent, it would just send you to this PDF that looked corrupted. But if you clicked it from a Chrome user agent, you would go to this PDF that looked corrupted, loaded within an iframe, but then it would pop up this JavaScript alert saying, oh, you need to install the improved font provider Chrome extension. And if you clicked OK, it would take you there. And this one magically was created just 4 or 5 days ago, but has 30 5-star reviews and has been used, I think it was like 68 people in total. Very first version, everything. This is actually, they have 2 versions of this. This is the most recent one, different name. And so, interestingly, too, some of the reviews were very specific. So this one was like, hey, if you're part of the UN committee, you should definitely install this because it's great. And what this would do is, can't really see it that well in there, but if they install the Chrome extension, it would give them permissions to all your tabs, all your cookies, etc. So anytime you would go to visit a specific page, and so they had not only like organization-specific pages in there, but also Yahoo, AOL, Gmail, Microsoft, etc., Hotmail, it would steal your username, password, and cookies for that site and send it back off to them. So they'll do everything from the basic cred phishing stuff to this. This sort of gives them some persistence on this front. One of the things we do see them do as soon as they get access to an account is they go and set up SMTP forwarding on the account. And so we've had a lot of people move from different, whether it be on-prem or other mail hosting solutions to O365 recently. And one of the things we're learning and seeing is that sometimes when they bring their forwarding rules with them, these forwarding rules might have been in place for 2, 3, 4 years, where Thallium has had persistent access to that mailbox over time, and the user had no idea. And so all of these have sort of led us into some initiatives that Magpie will talk a little bit more about, but notifying our users when they've been targeted or even compromised by some of these state-sponsored actors, and Thallium is definitely sort of leading the charge there.
So if you saw Elias talk yesterday, you'll see that when something happens to one of our customers, or indeed affects our customers through maybe a third party, such as supply chain attacks, then a lot of areas across Microsoft, product groups, MSRC, Mstic indeed, get involved, and it's about kind of assessing the scale of it, the damage, what can we roll out in terms of detections, and then in some cases we were even approached by third parties who were affected to notify on their behalf. So the reason I've kind of included this is to kind of talk about some of the trends. So this is certainly something we've seen as a growing trend. Whereas we've kind of seen some of the discussions about these third-party suppliers being compromised, I think in terms of kind of attribution for us, we see criminal gangs kind of starting off, although highly targeted in at least the 2 related cases there with the undisclosed vendors, where the targeting was specific to IPs that we're not entirely sure how they managed to tie it to the organizations that they were after. But we also see, APT actors, in particular, barium, which I'll touch upon a little bit more in a second, has been very busy in this space. So we've heard the CCleaner and the Shadowpad stuff, but also potentially TeamViewer. So from open source reporting, and if you mine VirusTotal, you can find some additional evidence there to suggest that perhaps TeamViewer themselves have suffered an issue, or at least in the case of CCleaner, Avast have suggested that was the route into their network. So if you've got legitimate credentials, you can obviously log in. You can get those credentials in a number of ways, phish them from the user, maybe even just brute force if it's a weak password. But this seems to be something that we've observed in IR cases and industry partners, where essentially a third-party remote solution provider has formed the kind of initial incursion into the network with no necessary kind of evidence to suggest credential harvesting up front. Kind of worrisome in some ways. But in this case, I think Barium seemed to drop their then sort of known payloads very quickly after each intrusion. So it was quite easy to at least detect malicious activity at that point. Obviously, if they'd wanted, they could have remained quite anonymous on the networks. So that's certainly something we're seeing, and has prompted us to take a little bit more of a step in towards the kind of the I guess takedowns, obviously used in the headline here, but the action against the actors to use some of our success against the Strontium actor, for example, in terms of seizing the domains, extending that to Barium and other actors as well. In one particular case, we actually had Ben, who was down for presenting this topic, and sadly he couldn't make it this week. He actually went with our global incident response team to a customer site and was able to, in kind of real time, not only advise them on maybe where they should look, having known this actor very well, but also examine logs, find new things, pivot, and basically build out that picture to not just help with the attribution piece, but then also to find onward victims and form the basis of a lot of notifications. Manganese is another group we track. Been around for a long, long time. You've seen APT1 kind of maybe come and go and come again. These guys have been around for just as long, very quiet for a long time. But although we don't see much from them in terms of kind of malware being deployed, because we've managed to keep track of them over the years, we can see when they do enter a victim network. And even if we don't, say, have something like ASC being affected or Windows Defender deployed across that network, we can still kind of see how they're abusing that compromise. And in this case, one interesting piece was they've taken a very kind of interesting approach of using that victim as a way to register for endpoint protection trials. So our own Windows Defender has been included. I don't think they've activated yet, but it'll be interesting if they do. But there's at least sort of 4 other providers where they've now got that software, probably installing it within a test network, hopefully not on their own enterprise network, but that would indeed be interesting for whoever gets that telemetry. But we're not seeing kind of like the new malware development, but this would suggest that they're testing malware, or at least testing techniques, so that they won't necessarily be caught out when they do hit the kind of intended targets in the future. And Strontium, probably the one outside of Zinc where we've kind of attribution by association or outright calling out the country in the Zinc case. Normal policy is not to attribute to a country or organization, hence why I didn't go into in depth with barium and manganese there. But Strontium, I guess everyone's seen kind of the association with Fancy Bear and IPT28. So it's no surprise we've been kind of active against some of their attacks for a long time now, particularly around the elections. We were recently mentioned in the press again. This has kind of been an interesting piece. So we kind of took steps before necessarily it was on the radar of a lot of other sort of TI providers or response companies to again use that kind of the ability to take the domain away from the actor before harm actually comes to the end target. And something else that we've done in this space, and particularly with the Thallium actor as well, is extend the notifications based on compromise to targeting as well. So being able to say, you weren't actually necessarily infected by this attack, or perhaps we blocked this attack, but we'd still like to tell you that this group has a particular interest in you. And that's kind of something that I think we'll continue to expand upon. Trying to do this at cloud scale, this crosses over all of the places we have visibility, whether it's on the endpoint, in the cloud, in the mailbox. And the initial feedback, I think, is pretty good from those who've received those notifications. But I think it's important to inform customers about what they didn't see because it was blocked just as much as when they have to take action to resolve an incident. Obviously, we've got a lot of news coverage on the recent Strontium piece. I think a lot of it was positive, which is great. But then we also had some more scathing reports, and I think RT in particular had 3 different reports out in the same day, essentially citing that other companies maybe didn't have any evidence that this was happening. Maybe that's based on visibility. But yeah, to basically try and say that we're trying to push a product, etc. And this is kind of, they can draw parallels with some of the initiatives we've started, but really this is kind of based on the work that we're doing and with some of our trusted partners to essentially stop an actor in their tracks and take that power away from them immediately. So we can ignore all that and try to keep doing the good work that we're doing there. Did your battery die? Yeah. Recently, as part of the what was the Digital Geneva Convention, now I believe Digital Peace, which has evolved quite a lot since that initial blog post by Brad some years ago, to a set of core principles now that really I think that as we develop this, and we've been working with partners who essentially are working in this space in a more humanitarian context. It's something that I think a lot of governments around the world will get on board with. And one of the kind of slides I had from that talk was talking about the kind of evolution in CNA. And so in this instance, it's very much kind of a shortened timeline with my take on sort of motivations and intent here. But it was kind of really to illustrate that if we kind of look at geographically where these are from, and not necessarily always the same group, but we kind of see very targeted attacks where the purpose was to disable systems, which is typically CNA rather than CNE, so attack rather than espionage, is to disable a system or to wipe data. Very surgical, very kind of controlled. We see kind of retaliation for that with the Shamoon attacks, which intent there was kind of like to strike back, but done in kind of a whatever the technology at the time in that country allowed them to do. The Sony Pictures is a bit of a strange one because I think that was very much retaliatory, but that put those actors on the map really for a lot of people. But if we look at kind of as time goes on, more frequent examples of CNA, all coming from the same region of the world, and although some of them tend to be focused on one particular region, we can see that it is definitely an increasing trend. But by the time we get down to the bottom, so Triton, a group that we call Dysprosium, we've been lucky enough to attribute those guys. But it's interesting, really, that that's probably where we move on from just CNA in terms of the examples we're used to, and we move into real-world actual harm. So the potential here to actually cause a safety system to fail, cause a plant to explode, the damage to human life. I think that's where we do start moving into the Geneva Convention that would apply in that kind of context, whereas previous examples have been essentially stuck in the cyber realm. So hopefully we won't really get to that point, but I think it's only a matter of time before we see loss of life because of a cyber attack, more directly so than, say, the efforts that have been used to kind of disrupt during a more traditional kind of military action. Cheers.
Yeah, so we don't hear as much anymore. Maybe a few years ago you would have heard of a lot of activity groups using O-Days. We don't see it as much, but we still do see it. So one of the groups this year that had a couple was a group we called Dubnium. So the first one was reported to us by Chihu. And when our MSRC analysts first looked at it, they said, oh, this actually reminds me a lot of one I worked last year, which was 2017-0149. And that was actually attributed to a group called Zinc. So at the time when they reported this, we didn't know which group was behind this. When O-Days do come in, our group is involved. We try to figure out who it is to sort of help inform the decisions that should be made and how we should approach it. And so what was interesting is that this ended up being a group we called Dubnium. And so on the left was that was the Zinc exploit. On the right was the recent Dubnium exploit. Obfuscation is the same, right? So don't know if this was intentional, don't know if they were just sharing the same package. We don't believe Zinc and Dubnium are related really at all. but it was interesting to make this note. And so there was also this carrier doc that would speak to auto sound checkers. And so we went and pivoted around on that information from the O-Day and started looking around. And ultimately we were able to find cases where it was appearing there was malware talking to those domains on systems that had Dubnium malware like AzureX and Scarcraft signatures, for example. We also think we pivoted into what appears to be maybe a development network or an adversary network where a bunch of the malware was all coming from initially. And that tied into some other accounts we had and sort of opened up the graph for us on what Dubnium was doing today. Interesting thing is I really personally hadn't tracked Dubnium for maybe 2 or 3 years, but because they use Node, now we're going to pay a lot of attention to you. And so this sort of opened up some old memories. But fast forward a month or two, and they were back at it again. Kaspersky, in their blog post about the first O-Day, they sort of hypothesized that the way the bug worked, they could probably modify it and use it again, and they definitely did. Trend Micro reported that. But again, they were using that same style of obfuscation, and it looked very similar. Overall, between 3 years ago and now, they've changed some things, but some of it still looks really familiar to me. Sort of the way they register domains and infrastructure still seems to be the same. They still do this trick, and you can go see some of the pictures where, like, the next stage payload is sort of using steganography or hidden within an image, and it can throw some analysts off. But overall, haven't changed, but still demonstrate a big capability here. They've had a lot of flash O-Days in the past, and IE, and this would sort of fall in that category as well. And so we're going to continue to keep a close eye on them and sort of watch for more O-Days coming out of them moving forward. They also have sort of had, as we tore this apart, they've had some really interesting targets. So they're very specific on who they target. They don't sort of blast things out, and that obviously goes into the equation when we're thinking about, okay, they've got an O-Day, how fast are we going to move on this, how prevalent is it? And so in this case, we were able to recover a mail where they were emailing someone in Cuba, but they were expecting that person to speak Korean, and it was super specific. I can't ID who the victim is. I couldn't based off the email address, but seems to be very, very particular. Some of the other victims we were able to sort of notice based on IP address, et cetera, seems to also be very, very specific and sort of global, not sort of focused on one region of the world. But they seem to have very surgical precision in that regard. And so with that, I'll let Magpie cover a bit of the trends.
So I've kind of covered some of these points, but I'm definitely going for the kind of supply chain, whether that is through software updates or whether it's providers of other items. Obviously, we were used to kind of CAs being hit and the code signing certs being stolen and passed around. CNA efforts, I definitely think it's one to watch, and it's worrying that we probably need a real world incident to really get some traction on that. But we're pushing as hard as we can to get efforts put in place to try and avoid it, really. APT as a service is probably a piece that we've also seen, but we haven't got any slides on. Happy to take some questions or discuss it later on. But this is a thing that I guess muddies the water quite a bit when it comes to companies performing threat intelligence and trying to attribute, when it's not just a 0-day that's being purchased by multiple customers, but you're also getting the 0-day, the weaponization of the documents produced on the same hosts, for example, the same malware families as the payloads, but then maybe your kind of the first foothold on the victim network is also being orchestrated by the third party that's being paid before handed off to specific customers. And often we've seen a customer who's purchased this kind of package, but they are on themselves, at least in the terms of geography, also a target of another paying customer. So it's interesting to see that it can easily look like it's a global effort, but it's probably 6-7 different paying customers, all funneled through one provider. And there's probably about 4 or 5 providers that we've seen illustrating this kind of thing in the last 12 months. It also means that if you don't have a huge development effort or the cash to build a multi-million-dollar framework, then it's probably quite affordable service for you, and it gives you that country the ability to perform CNE and also hide in the noise of other customers. SIM for infrastructure, we see that in terms of third-party providers or contracts where maybe one or two different APT groups in the same region tend to operate out of the same infrastructure, but very different missions, very different malware families, different tasking, and it does cause confusion. And the worst bit, I guess, is password spray. Having been involved in a number of different cases that have been escalated up, trying to track down the infrastructure and then onward back to the actor for password spray, it is a bit of a nightmare. So the guys in the identity team here at Microsoft, they are working on some great analytics to detect this. But I must say, when it comes to trying to attribute to a group, we all find it difficult with huge kind of scale of router compromises and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's a one for, I guess I'm going to say machine learning and AI, because then it gets it off my shoulders.
So with that, I think we're right at time, but any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to give them a round of applause. We're running very low on time. We can take one or two questions. Does anyone have a question?
If not, we'll be in the hallway afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thanks.